Sometimes, the most courageous thing we can do is look past a person's history to see their potential. We often build walls to keep the world out, forgetting that those same walls can keep us from witnessing the most beautiful transformations. This is a story about what happens when we choose to open our doors instead of locking them. The iron gates of the Miller estate creaked under the weight of a decade's worth of rust and tangled ivy. Elena stood before the Victorian manor, a heavy brass key pressing into her palm as the late afternoon sun cast long, amber shadows across the overgrown lawn. To the town of Oakhaven, this house was a landmark of prestige, but to Elena, it was a silent promise made to a grandfather who believed in the inherent goodness of every soul. Word of the inheritance had spread through the local coffee shops and hardware stores like wildfire. Neighbors paused their lawnmowers to stare, imagining the grand renovations or the high-priced sale that would surely follow. They saw a payday in the peeling white paint and the sagging porch, but Elena only saw the dusty rooms and the quiet, waiting stillness of a place that needed a new purpose. The first conflict arrived, not in the form of a storm, but in the shape of a town council notice, taped gently to the front door. The neighbors had already heard whispers, quiet little rumors, that Elena wasn't looking for contractors at all, but for residents who lacked a permanent address. The paper itself stood as a formal warning, a thin barrier of bureaucracy, meant to protect the status quo from the uncertainty Elena was about to invite into their quiet lives. As Elena spent her first night in the house, she scrubbed the grime from the tall, arched windows. And as the moonlight filtered through the newly cleared glass, she thought of Julian, the first man she had invited to stay. He was a man whose name appeared in police blotters more often than in phone books. Yet, when he spoke of his desire to work with his hands again, his voice had trembled with a sincerity no one had bothered to hear for years. The next morning, the first "Not in my backyard" sign appeared on the sidewalk just across the street. Elena watched from the porch, her eyes soft and thoughtful, as a group of local parents stood in a tight little circle, their voices hushed, but their gazes sharp and accusing. They didn't see the tired man carrying a single duffel bag up the driveway. They only saw a threat to their property values and their peace of mind. Julian stopped at the base of the stairs, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. And Elena, she didn't wait for him to reach the door. She walked down to meet him, extending a hand already stained with the dust of the house. "Welcome home, Julian," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the protesters across the street. "There's a pot of coffee on, and the kitchen floor needs a lot of love if you're ready to start." By the end of the week, 3 more residents had arrived. Sarah, a young mother who had lost everything in a series of bad breaks, and Marcus, an older veteran with a 1,000-yard stare. The house felt alive again, filled with the sounds of floorboards groaning under new footsteps and the smell of soap and sawdust. Yet, the air outside remained cold, thick with the silent judgment of a community that watched every movement from behind closed curtains. As Elena decided that silence was not the answer to fear, she set up a small table on the front lawn. She placed a lace tablecloth over the weathered wood and set out a tray of porcelain cups and a steaming teapot. And whenever a neighbor walked by with a scowl, she would offer a gentle wave and a simple invitation. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea and see the work we're doing?" Most people hurried past, their eyes fixed firmly on the pavement. But Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's reputation, finally stopped. She looked at the house, then at Elena, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line of disapproval. "You're bringing darkness into a place that used to be full of light, Elena," she whispered, her voice tight with a genuine, if misplaced, concern. "I think we're just shining a light on people who have lived in the dark for too long," Elena replied, pouring a cup of chamomile. She didn't argue or defend. She simply gestured toward Marcus, who was carefully sanding the intricate woodwork of the front railing. The veteran didn't look up, but the focused, rhythmic movement of his hands spoke of a peace he hadn't found in years. As the protests grew louder, a local news crew parked their van near the gate. And the reporter spoke of community tension and radical experiments in housing, framing Elena's choice as a battleground rather than a home. Inside, the residents gathered in the kitchen, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of a single overhead lamp, feeling the weight of the world's doubt pressing gently against the sturdy brick walls. "Maybe they're right," Sarah whispered, clutching a warm mug as if it were an anchor. "Maybe we don't belong in a place like this, surrounded by people who wish we weren't here." Elena looked around the table, seeing the flickering hope in their eyes, threatened by the shadows of their pasts. She knew that the house wasn't just a shelter for them. It was a testament to the fact that they were worthy of being seen. "The house doesn't care about your past, and neither do I," Elena said, her voice steady and filled with a quiet strength. She reached out and placed her hand over Sarah's, feeling the tremor of uncertainty in the younger woman's grip. "We aren't here to prove them wrong. We are here to prove to ourselves that we can build something beautiful out of what was left behind." That night, a brick was thrown through the parlor window, the glass shattering across the hardwood floor like fallen stars. The crash echoed through the halls, bringing everyone running into the room with hearts racing and old fears resurfacing. In the silence that followed, they looked at the jagged hole in the window and the cold night air rushing in, a harsh reminder of the world's hostility. Instead of calling the police or shouting into the street, Elena picked up a broom and began to sweep. One by one, the residents joined her, Julian picking up the larger shards, and Marcus finding a piece of plywood to cover the opening. There was no anger in their movements, only a collective, quiet determination to protect the sanctuary they were creating together. As the sun rose the next morning, the plywood patch was visible to the entire street, a scar on the face of the grand old house. Elena sat on the porch steps, watching the neighborhood wake up, her heart heavy but her resolve unbroken. She knew the friction was reaching its peak, and that the only way through the conflict was to show the town the hearts of the people they so desperately wanted to cast away. The local hardware store owner, a man named Mr. Henderson, was the first to notice the change in the residents' eyes. He watched from behind his counter as Julian walked in, not with a downward gaze of shame, but with a list of supplies and a steady voice. It was a small moment of commerce, yet it felt like a bridge being built over a canyon of years of misunderstanding and silent judgment. Elena spent her afternoons sitting on the porch, her presence a calm anchor amidst the swirling whispers of the neighborhood. She didn't hide the boarded-up window. Instead, she hung a flower box beneath it, filling it with bright yellow marigolds that caught the morning sun. It was a silent statement that beauty could still grow in the places where people had tried to break their spirit. One afternoon, a young boy from 3 houses down lost his ball over the Miller estate's high stone wall. He stood at the gate, trembling slightly, his eyes wide with the stories he'd heard about the dangerous people living inside. Marcus, who had been painting the trim of the garage, saw the boy and slowly set down his brush, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. Without a word, Marcus retrieved the ball from the tall grass and walked to the gate, kneeling so he was at the child's eye level. He didn't just toss it back. He struck up a quiet conversation about the local Little League team and the best way to throw a curveball. The boy's father, watching from across the street, took a hesitant step forward, his defensive posture softening as he saw the gentle smile on the veteran's face. Inside the house, Sarah was rediscovering a talent she had buried under years of survival, the art of baking. The scent of cinnamon and yeast began to drift from the kitchen windows, wrapping the old house in a blanket of comfort that felt like a hug. It was a smell that reminded everyone of home, even those who hadn't felt they had one for a very long time. Elena suggested they take the extra loaves to the local park, a place that had fallen into disrepair and was now avoided by families. At first, the residents were hesitant, fearing the cold stares they encountered on the sidewalks, but Elena led the way with a basket on her arm. They arrived at the park, not as invaders, but as neighbors, carrying the simple gift of warm bread. As the day settled softly over the quiet neighborhood, the park stood like a skeleton of its former self, with rusted swings and graffiti-covered benches that mirrored the way the world had viewed the residents. Julian looked at the broken chains of the swing set and the peeling paint of the slide, his hands gently itching to fix what was broken. He didn't ask for permission. He simply returned the next day with his toolbox and a gallon of forest green paint. Soon, the sound of rhythmic hammering and the scraping of wire brushes replaced the uneasy silence of the park. Passers-by stopped to watch as the troublemakers spent their Saturday morning sweating under the sun to restore a playground they didn't even use. It was a confusing sight for the town. People they had labeled as takers were now giving back with everything they had. A small group of teenagers, usually bored and looking for trouble themselves, drifted toward the park to watch Julian work. Instead of shooing them away, Julian handed a sanding block to the tallest boy and showed him how to smooth the rough edges of the wooden benches. In that moment, the barrier between us and them began to thin, worn down by the shared effort of manual labor. Mrs. Gable watched from her window, her binoculars resting forgotten on the sill as she saw the transformation of the park. She saw Sarah sitting on a blanket, sharing slices of bread with a young mother who had finally felt safe enough to bring her toddler to the swings. The threat she had feared was turning out to be the very heartbeat the community had been missing for years. As the town council meeting gathered that week, the room was packed, and the atmosphere had shifted from anger to a gentle, profound curiosity. In the back row sat Elena, her hands folded softly in her lap, listening with quiet care. One by one, neighbors stood to speak, sharing the small acts of kindness they had witnessed. They spoke of fixed fences, of groceries carried with helping hands, and of the way the old Miller house now glowed with a soft, inviting light at night. One woman stood up, her voice trembling as she admitted she had been one of the people who signed the petition to evict the residents. "I realized I wasn't afraid of them," she confessed to the hushed room. "I was afraid of the parts of myself that didn't know how to be a neighbor." Elena felt a tear prick her eye, not of sadness, but of the overwhelming relief that comes when a heart finally begins to unburden itself. Back at the house, the residents had begun a new project, restoring the grandfather's old sunroom. They worked into the evening, the soft clinking of tools and the low murmur of conversation, creating a symphony of productivity. They were no longer just individuals under one roof. They were a family, bonded by the shared experience of being forgiven and finding a reason to forgive themselves. Elena found Marcus standing in the garden late one night, looking up at the stars that seemed to hang low over the gabled roof. "I used to think the world was just a series of rooms I wasn't allowed to stay in," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elena stood beside him, the cool night air smelling of damp earth and the promise of a new season, knowing exactly what he meant. The next morning, Elena found a small, handwritten note tucked into the iron gate, where the "Not in my backyard" signs used to hang. It wasn't an apology, but a simple request. "Our community center roof is leaking. Do you think your team could help us look at it?" It was the first time the town had used the word team to describe the people living in the house. Julian and Marcus didn't hesitate. They loaded the old truck with ladders and shingles, making their way toward the heart of the town they had once been told to leave. As they worked on the roof, the sun warming their backs, they looked out over the rooftops of Oakhaven. And there, they saw a town that was beginning to look less like a collection of strangers and more like a home they were proud to protect. By the time they finished the repair, the sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant shades of violet and gold. The town librarian brought out a tray of lemonade, her smile genuine and warm as she thanked them for their hard work. For the first time in his life, Julian felt the weight of his past lift, replaced by the solid, honest pride of a job well done. The final phase of the house's transformation didn't begin with a grand ceremony, but with the simple act of removing the heavy iron gates. Elena watched as Julian and Marcus unbolted the rusted hinges, laying the barriers flat on the grass to be repurposed into a community garden trellis. It was a silent invitation to the neighborhood, signaling that the era of suspicion had officially come to an end. As the gates came down, the first person to walk up the driveway was Mrs. Gable, carrying a small potted rose bush and a look of quiet humility. She didn't offer a long speech, but her eyes spoke of a deep realization as she handed the plant to Sarah, who was kneeling in the fresh soil. "I think this belongs in a place where things are allowed to grow again," the older woman whispered. By mid-morning, the front lawn of the Miller estate had turned into a bustling hub of shared stories and spontaneous labor. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid the house were now leaning over the porch railings, sharing tips on painting and gardening with the residents. The uncomfortable friction of the past few months had smoothed into a steady, warm rhythm of mutual respect and newfound friendship. Inside the house, the grand parlor was no longer a museum of the past, but a vibrant classroom for the future. Sarah had started a small baking workshop for local teenagers, the air thick with the sweet scent of vanilla and the sound of youthful laughter. These kids didn't see a woman with a troubled history. They saw a mentor who taught them that even the messiest dough could become something nourishing. Marcus stood in the center of the newly restored community center, looking up at the ceiling he had patched with his own two hands. The town mayor approached him, not with a formal handshake, but with a hand on his shoulder and a genuine question about his time in the service. For the first time, Marcus didn't feel the need to hide his scars. He saw them as part of the strength he now used to support others. As the town's annual autumn festival was held on the grounds of the estate, a sea of golden leaves and orange pumpkins dotted the emerald lawn. String lights draped from the ancient oaks, casting a soft, magical glow over the hundreds of people who gathered to celebrate the house that had saved their spirit. It was a tapestry of lives woven together, the wealthy, the struggling, the old, and the young, all sharing the same light. Elena sat on the top step of the porch, her grandfather's old pocket watch clicking softly in her hand as she watched the scene unfold. She saw Julian laughing with the hardware store owner, their heads bent together over a set of blueprints for a new low-income housing project. The house had served its purpose, not by being a fortress, but by being a catalyst for a town that had forgotten how to forgive. As the music from the festival drifted through the open windows, Elena felt a sense of completion wash over her like a warm summer rain. The rooms were full, the garden was blooming, and the hearts within these walls were finally beating in sync with the world outside. She realized that her grandfather hadn't left her a building. He had left her the opportunity to prove that love is the most powerful restoration tool in existence. As the months drifted by, the final "Not in my backyard" sign was discovered, tucked beneath a small pile of scrap wood in the garage. And gently, thoughtfully, Julian turned it over, using the back of it to paint a brand new welcome sign. Now, at the edge of the property, it stands quietly, a simple wooden board that reads, "Everyone is someone's second chance." It is the very first thing people see when they arrive in Oak Haven, a warm reminder of the miracle that unfolds when we stop judging and start listening. The story of the Miller House became a legend in the valley, a testimony to the fact that no soul is ever truly lost if someone is willing to leave the light on. Transformation isn't about erasing where we've been, but about choosing where we are going together, one brick and one heart at a time. In the end, Elena didn't just change a few lives. She taught an entire town that the most beautiful homes are the ones with the widest doors. May we all find the courage to see the light in others, especially when they are struggling to find it in themselves. The greatest gift we can offer is the space to grow, the grace to fail, and the warmth of a home that never gives up.